deposition, and I will begin by talking about river deposits in archaeology generally, the archaeology of Roman bridges, and then I'm going to move on to this case study that Philip and I have just recently completed, which is the Roman site of Bridge in Britain, and introduce the site and the material, and then I will end by talking about river deposits in Britain more widely. So that's the plan. Approaches to river deposits. So when we look at river deposits in prehistory, we get this kind of thing. Gruesome ritual. You know, even the dog looks slightly dangerous. You know, and it's all about offerings and ritual and that kind of stuff. And a similar thing happens in the medieval period, where we do find weapons deposited in British and other rivers. So there's a strong emphasis on ritual offerings. Some of this goes back to the work of my colleague Richard Bradley in archaeology, who wrote a very, very important book called The Passage of Arms, which examined deposits in water compared to deposits in land in prehistory. And he explored some of these ideas, and they've really been very widely accepted in prehistory and medieval archaeology. And he more recently wrote an update on this called The Geography of Offerings, which again expands on some of these themes. When we see these spectacular objects from rivers in the Iron Age, people generally think of them as ritual offerings. However, when we come to the Roman period, that is very much not the case. So when we're dealing with things within structures, Romanists are willing to contemplate ritual meaning. So for example, the springs at Bath, which obviously have hundreds and thousands of objects in them, or a well like this one in London. But when it comes to rivers, Romanists tend to be a lot more hesitant to ascribe meaning. And on this slide, you can see two spectacular assemblages of Roman objects, Roman metal objects from the Rhine in Germany. Neupots on the left and Xanten on the right. Now, both of these enormous assemblages have essentially been interpreted as accidental losses. So the argument with Neupots is that Alemannic raiders come across the Rhine, they go into Gaul, they raid a villa or multiple villas, they take this material back across the Rhine and their boat sinks. Okay, and this is, well, you know, it's possible, and I'll come back to it. It's not impossible, but I'm just saying that is the preferred interpretation. And with Xanten, this material is earlier, so it might be to do with the Batavian Wars in the way that those colleagues have interpreted it. Now, I'm not saying that there are not accidental losses in rivers. Clearly, there's huge potential to lose material. This is Trajan's column, and you can see a soldier they would have been trained to carry equipment across the water. So if they are doing that on foot or on horseback, or if there's a battle by a riverside, it is quite possible that, you know, significant amounts of military equipment, for example, could end up in a river. And it's also quite possible that boats sink, you know, as you cross a major river, that is a possibility. And finally, we could think about the more mundane formation processes, such as rubbish deposits being eroded by a river. So if we look at Roman London, for example, the way that the Thames has moved means that the Thames now erodes what were Roman settlement deposits. So all these people who are mudlarking are finding Roman settlement finds, but they are not river finds in that sense, if you see what I mean, because they are just eroded settlements. At other sites like Lincoln, there are large groups of Roman objects which were deposited in the river. So at Lincoln, sadly not published, there are huge rubbish deposits, including animal bone, and they appear to be rubbish deposits, and I'll come back to how we might define that. And of course, you know, because it's the classics department, we could talk about, you know, the Tiber as well. That rivers, there's always a lot of activity next to rivers, and that includes the deposition of rubbish, unwanted material as well. However, I also think that there could be ritual deposition in the Roman period, so that people make deliberate offerings, so that's the Nibelungen hoard, or, so that could be one big hoard, or it could be repeated small-scale offerings by people as they cross a river. So it's a cumulative deposit as well. That's another possibility. So I'll come back to some of these themes in a moment. So that's, I think, the background on rivers. On bridges, obviously the Roman world has spectacular bridges, you know, wonders of infrastructure, and that's very much how they've been studied. It's about engineering. It's about, you know, to me, very boring. Okay, so, you know, what is the span of the, you know, the arch, and where is the abutment, and how long does it take to build it? You know, I'm not deeply interested in that, but I can see it's a research tradition. However, they are rarely about the way that bridges are liminal, you know, liminal spaces. They are about crossing from one domain to another. And in many cultures, they have ritual meaning. So this is a reconstruction of the site of Laten itself, so a late Iron Age site. And, you know, again, if you just look at the art, gloomy, you know, skulls, animals, people looking worried, all that kind of thing. And then you look at a reconstruction of some Roman bridges, which are completely devoid of people to start with, and absolutely perfect. You know, there is no stone out of place. They are just these, and I'm not saying they are wrong. I'm just saying we are making deliberate choices about which aspects of these bridges we prioritize in our interpretation. So, you know, in my mind, bridges have other significance as well, and rivers do. So when we actually look at Roman religion, river gods are powerful and dangerous beings. So here again, this is Trajan's column, and you can see the river Danube looking on as soldiers cross a pontoon bridge. Now, clearly, if the river god is angered, look at his size. You know, he could destroy that bridge in a moment. So there need to be sacrifices and appeasement of the river gods when Romans build bridges or cross rivers. And we know, I mean, you know, there's a debate, and you will know this better than me, but there's a debate about the meaning of the word pontifex even. But, you know, if it means bridge maker, it is about connecting these different worlds. And also in Christian thought, you know, bridges are very significant. So I think there is more to the idea of the bridge than perhaps in the Roman world than we have perhaps acknowledged. And that is also suggested by things like this. So stones, I've picked out 3 here where they, you know, various symbols or deities are used to protect the bridge, basically. And that is, you know, something perhaps that's been overlooked as well. And then we have evidence for actual offerings. So again, this is Trajan's column, and you can see the emperor making a sacrifice in front of the new bridge. And, you know, river crossings in history are, you know, there are significant moments where people make or fail to make offerings that then, you know, lead to disaster because the campaign ends in disaster because of that. So the general argument I've made is we need to rethink both these top 2 categories. Now I'm going to introduce you to this site at Piercebridge, that, and then we'll look at the details of that material. So Piercebridge is in County Durham, so it's you can see York on the map here, Deer Street, which is the street running north up to Hadrian's Wall and Corbridge. And Piercebridge sits just at the spot where this major Roman road, Deer Street, where it crosses a big river. The Tees is quite a significant river. And you can see there is some indigenous settlement in that area, also some military sites and a few villas. Now, Piercebridge, the site itself, has a long and quite complicated history. So the earliest occupation is actually off to the right of this slide, just south of the river, at a site called Home House. Then north of the river in the area marked as Toft's Field, that's where the earliest settlement is. Now there ought to be, given what we know about the Roman conquest of this region, and given the strategic importance, there ought to be a Flavian fort here, but nobody has found it yet. So there may or may not have been a fort there, but you know, there is certainly settlement. And then the fort that we know about is 3rd century, and it's underneath the modern village. So you can just, on the left, north of the river, you can just see the corners of the fort peeking out, yeah? Just there, the rectangular shape. And there are a number of bridges. So the river flows from left to right, and the first bridge is the modern, well, 17th, 18th century stone bridge. The ones that we are interested in is Bridge 1 here, which is the one on the line of Beer Street, and then there is a stone bridge, and I'll come back to that. Now, at the site of Pierce Bridge, 2 gentlemen called Rolf Mitchinson and Bob Middlemass, who were metal detectorists and amateur divers, started to go into the Tees to look for structures, bridges, and Roman finds. They started to do this in the 1980s, and they carried on right until 2017 or something like that. And my colleague, Philippa Walton, who we did this project together, she was at the time the Finds Liaison Officer for the region. There are people familiar with the idea, so the Portable Antiquity Scheme, which liaises with metal detectorists, she was the person responsible for that region. And Rolf and Bob kept giving her boxes and margarine tubs and bags full of Roman objects. And obviously it indicated that something a bit special was going on. Now, it's quite difficult to relate exactly. They didn't GPS their finds, okay? So in an ideal world, they would have recorded, and I'll come back to that, exactly where they come from. But we can relate their finds to the bridges. And I should add, so when they were diving, they also recorded timbers in the riverbed, okay? So we now think that there are actually 3 bridges. So the first one is between the Stone Bridge and the Deer Street Bridge, yeah, the one number 1. And Time Team actually came out and did an episode on Pierce Bridge in, I think, 2003, which you can find on YouTube, if you like. It's quite funny. And they also looked at these timbers, and then there was a little bit of radiocarbon dating done by that team. So this earliest bridge is really interesting because it dates to about 40 BC to AD 85. I'll come on to that in a minute. The main Deer Street Bridge, which ought to be Flavian or just after, given the history of the region, we'll have some dating evidence from the radiocarbon, but we know it must have been there round about AD 90 because we have dating evidence from Toft's Field. So the road in Toft's Field is there by AD 90, therefore a bridge must have been there. The stone bridge, maybe early 3rd century, it's very poorly dated. So we've got 3 bridges. Now the earliest one, as I've said, looks to be, might well be, even before AD 70. So that would be before the Roman conquest of the region. But there were also some later coins, much later coins associated with it. And I don't know whether that is because material is redistributed or whatever else is going on. If it is as early as AD 70 or, you know, thereabouts, it might actually relate also to the late prehistoric river crossing that must have existed in this region. So if you look on the map, use this pointer, so if you come up from Scotch Corner to Pierce Bridge, that's the Roman road, but not far off that is Stannick, which is a major Iron Age settlement or oppidum associated with Queen Cartimandua. And that oppidum has a little gate on the northeast corner, and there's a modern footpath which Colin Hazelgrove argues could reflect an earlier routeway. So I think it's not impossible, that you know, that there is an earlier river crossing. Now, the main one on Deer Street, as I've said, should be about AD 90. The two radiocarbon dates we have are AD 129 and AD 253 with various error margins. What that must mean is that this bridge keeps being repaired, and what we happen to have what they happen to sample are later timbers, if that makes sense. Now the divers, this is an example of the kind of sketch plans the divers produced. There were clearly multiple phases, and it's very confusing, and I don't think they understood what they found, so we can't rely on that for any kind of detailed reconstruction, but there must be multiple phases. And that makes sense because the Tees, I don't know if anybody has been, if you remember that first slide on a sunny day, the Tees looks, it's, you know, it's very shallow, it's quite pleasant. But on a rainy day, it's terrifying. And it would have been more so before the dam and river control measures were put in the 1950s. So we know, for example, in the 18th century, severe flooding would regularly destroy, you know, bridges like this, and the same must have happened in the Roman period. So you would have had to repair them repeatedly. Another thing, and this is not usually done for Roman river finds, is we looked a bit at the environment of the fluvial environment in a bit more detail. So there are these gravel banks that form, and we've got these historic maps, so you can see 1 is the modern bridge, 2 is Deer Street, 3 is Deer Street, 4 is the stone bridge, and you can see these brown blocks shifting about. So these gravel banks, because it's a fast river and it moves the gravel and then deposits it, the location of these gravel banks changes and will bury the Roman remains in different ways. And there is also a later mill stream there and some kind of weir. So all of these things are affecting our finds. Now, the divers did keep a diary, but unfortunately there isn't a clear link. So you might spot an object and it might say site A or site A3, but it's then quite difficult to match it to where that is on the sketch plans. We have a rough idea that most of the material comes from immediately near the bridge, the timber structures, and you can see they gradually widen their search area. They would go and dive, stir, so they go from one bank to the other, stir everything up, let the mud settle, and go back and pick things out, okay? So there is no stratigraphy, and there isn't an accurate record of what was found together or anything like that. So we have to treat the finds as an unstratified assemblage, effectively, even though we think most of them are immediately associated with this bridge. So, what have we got? So Philippa spent a long time, recording on the Portable Antiquity Scheme with a huge group of volunteers, 2,200 objects, nearly 1,500 coins, pottery and animal bone. For each object, you have to imagine that you have to take record photos. So there are record photos with multiple views, and there is a detailed catalogue entry. So it's a horrendous amount of work, but also a brilliant, brilliant resource that's completely open access. So for each object, you know, parallels, date, description, everything that you could possibly want. And they break down in this way. So if there is this late Iron Age bridge, they don't deposit very much, if anything. So we've got hardly anything from the Iron Age. The vast majority is Roman. There's a few bits and pieces that are early or later medieval and even post-medieval, but there is not a lot. The bulk of it is clearly Roman. And that's interesting because the divers picked up everything. So whatever goes on stops after the Roman period, more or less. So then we started to think about how can we, so you remember when we set out, we said, is this rubbish? Is this eroded settlement? is it an accidental ship? I think we can discount the shipwreck, okay, but is it eroded rubbish or is it ritual deposition? And one way to test that is to look at the totality of the assemblage rather than just the best bits. If I just pick out the silver coins, I'm going to say, yeah, it's ritual. Or just the bronze figurines, of which there are some really nice examples. Little Cupid, all sorts of other things. But if I look at the whole thing, I will get a better impression. So we did that. We looked at every single thing, all the scraps of lead, all the bits of animal bone, everything. And we also tried to compare that data to the excavated finds. Because the question is, if it's eroded settlement material, the river stuff should be the same as what is found on land. Make sense? So, you can do this easily for the coins, okay? So, for example, here you can see, so the periods are at the bottom going from early to late Roman, and then you can see the Piercebridge excavation coins in orange, the Piercebridge river coins in blue. They're different. They are not the same. So the Piercebridge river coins are on the whole slightly earlier than the excavated ones. So we're certainly not eroding contemporary stuff. That's perhaps because most of the excavations were in the fort, not right next to the bridge, but still it's an interesting observation. Also, denominations, I haven't got a slide, but the denominations are different. So we have way more silver coins in the river than we should. We can do the same for the finds. Again, they're different, okay? So they are not behaving in the same way. We looked at the animal bone. So the animal bone looks normal, if you like. So if you were thinking it was going to be ritual, you would think lots of skulls, perhaps, or something like, you know, some kind of unusual selection. That is not the case. They are looking like the settlement evidence. We also had a few radiocarbon dated just to make sure that these are not like medieval cows that somebody's dumped in the river or something. And they all came out Roman. That was good, with quite a wide range. So it doesn't seem to be one event. It seems to be multiple events, both on the basis of the finds and the animal bones. So what that made us think is that something is going on here, okay? Our river finds are different to the material from the fort, which is that rectangular bit with the village on top of it. So that could be because Toft's Field, which is the empty field to the north, is earlier. The settlement there is earlier. Or it could be because they're very different activities. The bridge seems to be in use longer than we thought. Yeah, so if we look at these dates of AD 129 and 253, that would mean why would there still be repairs to Bridge 2 when Bridge 3 is, the stone bridge is supposed to have already existed? So maybe there was some kind of platform at Bridge 2 or a footbridge and people still using it, perhaps for offerings, perhaps for other things. But it's challenging some of our perception of the site, basically. Okay. Now I want to say a bit more about what we can do with the material itself. And here are those figurines I've mentioned. So you've got lovely ram, you've got that little Cupid, you know, they're quite nice objects like that. What we did was we broke them down into functional categories, again to explore how typical they are of the wider assemblage and area. So you can see here that, you know, the categories are standard categories that we would use in Roman artifact analysis. There are religious objects, but there's also lots of other stuff. And we can use those to say something about the people who use, not about why they deposit them, but the people who deposited them, okay? So one point to make is there is a lot of, well, there's a bit of material that relates to very British, very Romano-British objects, and these are generally quite early and quite a long way. These are typically southern objects. So these have come from southern Britain. We can say a lot about their military community. So if you think back to the Rhine, that was all about weapons and helmets. We have none of that up here. We have no swords at all, but we have an awful lot of belt fittings. So these lovely images are of the elements of the belt that are really, really common here, and that tells us about the presence of legionary and auxiliary soldiers. And we played around with this. Again, we tried to compare. So on the right, you've got the Pierce Bridge excavations. On the left, you have the river finds. And we're trying to give you a heat map of quantities, if that makes sense, yeah? So you can see that the river has way more of these belt fittings as opposed to the fittings of swords. Does that come across? Yeah. So more belt fittings and more strap ends, which are these little dangly bits there, than is typical on the site. And again, to me, that suggests selection, because you would argue that should be roughly the same, but it isn't. So that may be that soldiers, as they were crossing the river, make an offering of a small part of their gear. That is perhaps not the most critical part of their gear. You know, if you offer your helmet or your sword, that's a big deal. But a small bit of belt fitting is much more of a symbolic offering. They also deposit an awful lot of horse gear. So we have more horse gear from this site. Philippa keeps saying this, more horse gear than all of the auxiliary forts from Hadrian's Wall combined in the river, you know. So clearly harness fittings end up in the river quite a lot. And there's some lovely, lovely examples here. We can see, though, that it's not an entirely male community. So we have evidence for women. And we try to get to the women by looking at hairpins, for example, which are strongly associated with women in Roman Britain. And we played around with the diameters of the finger rings. So I know people can wear them at different fingers, but in general, the smaller ones are thought to be associated with women and children. So we looked at some of that. And interestingly, some of the fanciest gold ones are actually very, very small indeed. And some of these gold ornaments as well have exotic connections, so they might relate to Danube provinces. So they're not common in Britain, but relate to further afield. And that's what we're trying to express on this slide. So there are some objects, and you know, we shouldn't be surprised by that. We shouldn't be surprised by there being long distance connections on a site like this, which is right on Deer Street. So anybody that has to go to Hadrian's Wall, not by boat, by foot or on horseback, would be crossing here. So, you know, I think that's a nice illustration of the sort of connectivity of the site. Okay, this might be a step too far, but so then what we try to do, this is where everybody glazes over, sorry. So correspondence analysis, people familiar with this idea? Rachel's gone, yeah. Everybody else goes, no. So correspondence analysis is where you group assemblages. So what you're trying to do is you have assemblages of different sizes, and you're trying to work out whether there are biases or trends within those assemblages. So we compared the river finds to Winchester and Catterick, as well as the Pierce Bridge excavations. So 3 nearby excavated sites. And the way you look at this graph is that the things, the object, functional categories, if they cluster near a site, do you see what I mean? They are more common on that site. That's how you read the graph. So if you were looking, for example, at the Pierce Bridge excavations, there are more items associated with recreation and personal adornment, relatively speaking, the Pierce Bridge excavation than there are in the Pierce Bridge River. Does that make sense? Yeah, so where they cluster. More textile equipment associated with Catterick, a lot more weighing and equine equipment associated with the river, which is what I've just highlighted. Now, some of these things are actually to do with taphonomy. So recreational equipment is actually mainly bone counters, which would have floated away in the river. But some of it, I think, is real, like the military equine equipment. So we can think about that. So what I think, yeah, and I should say agricultural, I don't know if anybody spotted, Piersbridge River is very heavily in the agricultural equipment, and that is actually agricultural and fishing. And that is because there's an awful lot of lead weights from nets in the river, and these nets, these little lead weights are never normally published, you know, so people ignore them, but clearly, I think they're Roman, and there are Dutch sites where you can find matching ones. But anyway, so yeah, we recorded literally everything, all the pottery, all the lead, everything. So what I think this allows us to do is to paint a bit of a different picture of this river crossing. Some of the material, some of the pottery, some of the animal bone, most of it in fact, some of the metal finds could well be rubbish. They could be eroded from Toft's field, or they could have just been tipped into the river to get rid of them, which, you know, is perfectly reasonable case to make. On the other hand, by looking at the entire assemblages and by carrying out these comparisons with the excavated material, I think there's quite a strong case that there's a significant part of the assemblage that is deliberately deposited for whatever reason. And we tried to express this in this reconstruction image by Aaron Watson. So the little ram that I think you saw earlier on one of the slides is being offered, and there's somebody scattering something into the river as well. But also he tried to make the bridge look more flimsy and just, you know, more not as pristine, and with people. People that come out slightly large, but you know what I mean. It's meant to get us to think. And also to highlight that there are these multiple phases to this bridge, that they keep having to repair it as they go along. One thing that these offerings might be related to is a specific deity. So there is a deity called Mars Condatis, which means Mars of the Confluence. And this, so the drawing of this altar at the top right was actually found at Piersbridge. And at Piersbridge, there is a confluence of a smaller stream with the Tees, right near this bridge, which I should have pointed out earlier, I forgot. So it has been argued that perhaps the shrine to Mars Condatis was at Piersbridge, and you can see the other places in northern Britain where altars to him have been found, but it has been assumed that the shrine was at Piersbridge, and it's quite possible that these offerings relate to that. If you're interested, you can read about this. So the book is out and it is open as gold. It's gold open access, so you can check it out online and download it and read it and have a look at it. And that covers all the discussion of bridges and river deposits as well as the material. What I want to do now, just to finish, is to talk a little bit about river deposits more broadly. So as we started to do this project, we realized that nobody had ever systematically looked at river deposits in Britain. And really, across the Roman world, you know, there are these accounts, so Annalisa will know about the Tiber, you know, the huge numbers of coins, but what people do is they publish the fancy coins. They publish, the Leary is another example, you know, oh yeah, that's really fancy, interesting Republican coinage. Happens to be from the river, nobody talks about that, and nobody talks about the tens of thousands of other coins that were found there as well. And the same is kind of true in Britain. So, you know, the head of Hadrian from the Thames or the head of Nero from the Old are mentioned, but, you know, that's not really explored. And there is no overview of all the river finds, which is what Philippa and I started to do, and we're hoping to apply, we're applying for money right now to do a full survey of all of those sites. And what that involves is to actually go around and, in the literature, not physically, and actually check out these things. So this is on the time, a possible shipwreck, this one actually, possible. But, you know, checking what the finds are, checking the context, looking at Lincoln and the rubbish, and record everything. And also dismiss some of the things that are down as river finds, but actually are not, if you see what I mean. To then compare Are these things found in the riverbed, the river bank, or near the river? Because people conflate that all the time. Has the river moved? Because they tend to, right? So you need to actually look at the geomorphology and the fluvial context as well. So we're building, so we've started some of this work, but we're doing a much bigger project across Britain. And we also got really interested in other sites that have vast river deposits. And the one I want to talk to you about is Trier in Germany. So the Raymond Bridge in Trier is very famous because bits of it still stand. And the museum, highlights some of the amazing finds that come from the Moselle right next to the bridge. You see the figurines there. But that's what I mean about cherry picking again. So people will say, yes, of course, that's ritual because we have these stunning figurines. But what else is there from the river? And that's quite interesting because there are vast quantities of stuff. So the museum estimated that about 500,000 coins were extracted from the Moselle during periods of low water. So you can see here a picture from 1974. There was another period in 1990 where they do work on the river upstream. And the water is stopped effectively, and there's very low water. And these people go into the river, you can see, and just dig out vast quantities of stuff. Of these, roughly, they thought 30,000 coins ended up in the museum. And also lots of things like lead seals and bronze objects and all sorts of things. So we were very lucky to obtain a small grant from the Ardiola Trust, and that's Philippa there in the middle. And we went out, and Carolina de Lima and Reinhold Schwartz. So we funded a couple of people to go and actually count the coins, because we thought, well, we have no idea how nothing is accessioned. So Trier Museum is a fabulous. Has anybody been to Trier? Yeah, beautiful museum. The most astonishing material, but they're sinking. They have got so much it is not even inventorized. So we thought, right, let's do this. They spent 6 weeks sorting these coins into groups by emperor. Yeah. So we now know that there are just over 30,000 coins, and we have a chronological profile for the first time, which is an amazing achievement in 6 weeks. Yeah. I don't know if anybody here has done numismatic work, but that is fast. That is very fast indeed. And we did this by throwing things into buckets. So we're just like, okay, Nero, whatever, and sorted into that. So they were superstars. And we can then come up with a chronological profile. So you can see at the top the chronological profile for the river coins, 30,937. And then we can compare, that's a bit of a rubbish slide, but we can compare that to the overall Trier profile and do the same thing that we've done before. But then we also started to worry slightly, because as they're doing the coins, Carolina and Philippa noticed that there are very few silver coins, very few. So they're underrepresented. And also there are very few of the earlier coins. Now the bridge in Trier is early, and the settlement in Trier is early. So this peak is quite odd. So one thing that slightly worried us is whether, and here's another lovely pictures of the 70s collectors, whether they retained the early material, which is usually easier to identify, and the silver coins, because they were perceived to be more valuable. So what we really need to do now is talk to these collectors who are still alive, and in their living rooms. I mean, look at that, pretty amazing stuff that they have found in the river. And that's the next step now. And we're kind of stuck with that a little bit, because there are legal implications for German finders, and we have to sort those out. But I think it's another example of the source criticism that you need to undertake in order to interpret the entire assemblage, because Otherwise, you'd be misled by what has ended up in the museum. It could be that the picture is real. So if you look at spring sanctuaries on the continent, they are low-value coins. So Piers Bridge might be the exception with the high-value coins, but we need to get to the bottom of that because at the moment that is simply unknown. So hopefully what I've shown you is that there are lots of ways in which material can end up in rivers. All of them are interesting, even if it's a rubbish tip being eroded. But some of this material, I think, has ended up in the river deliberately. And we need to change the way that we look at this material. So we're proposing a completely new method, which involves looking at the entire assemblage, however hard that is, looking at a comparison with the excavated material and integrating the fluvial and geomorphological data in that analysis. So it remains to just say thank you very much and thank all the people who have supported this work. Thank you.